In today's episode, we're exploring 5 tragic stories where people thought they could tame the untamable. From a wealthy rancher's daughter who treated a Bengal tiger like an oversized house cat, to a lonely widow whose friendship with a black bear ended in her own kitchen. But first, let's begin with the first story where a young woman's naive love for a tiger became her death sentence. It was July 19th, 2015, and the Texas heat was brutal even as evening approached, with temperatures still hovering near 100 degrees across the sprawling ranch outside Houston. The Martinez family's 500-acre property stretched endlessly under the blazing sun, dotted with oil derricks that had made them wealthy beyond imagination. Behind the main house, a series of custom-built enclosures housed an exotic menagerie that would make most zoos envious. Ashley Martinez was 22 and had never been told no in her entire life. The daughter of oil baron Roberto Martinez, she'd grown up with every privilege money could buy: private schools, European vacations, and the unshakable belief that wealth could solve any problem. 3 years earlier, she'd convinced her father to purchase Raja, a Bengal tiger cub, after seeing one at a private exotic animal auction in Dallas. Ashley had bottle-fed Raja from 6 weeks old, spending countless hours playing with him as he grew from a playful cub into a magnificent 400-pound predator. She genuinely believed their bond transcended the normal human-animal relationship, often telling visitors that Raja was more like a dog than a wild animal. Her father had hired exotic animal experts to advise on Raja's care, but Ashley consistently ignored their warnings about the tiger's increasingly dangerous behavior. The ranch hands had noticed changes in Raja over the past 6 months. The tiger had been displaying more territorial behavior, pacing his enclosure aggressively and showing signs of sexual maturity that made him unpredictable. Several experts had recommended relocating Raja to a professional facility, but Ashley refused to consider separating from her baby. Bengal tigers are among the world's most powerful predators, with males weighing up to 500 pounds and possessing bite forces exceeding 1,000 pounds per square inch. Despite being hand-raised, they retain all their wild instincts and become increasingly dangerous as they reach sexual maturity around age 3. Their hunting instincts are hardwired into their DNA, and no amount of human contact can eliminate their predatory nature. That evening, Ashley was making her daily visit to Raja's enclosure, carrying fresh water and planning to spend time with him as she did every day. The tiger's habitat was impressive. Nearly an acre of fenced area with trees, a pond, and various enrichment features. But no amount of space could change what Raja fundamentally was: an apex predator designed by evolution to kill. Ashley unlocked the enclosure gate and stepped inside, calling out to Raja in the baby talk voice she'd used since he was a cub. The tiger emerged from the shade of a large oak tree, his massive frame moving with fluid grace. At 3 years old and 400 pounds, Raja was in his prime, a magnificent specimen with piercing amber eyes and distinctive black stripes across his golden coat. What Ashley failed to notice were the subtle signs that Raja's behavior had fundamentally changed. His ears were slightly flattened, his tail twitched with agitation, and his gaze held a predatory intensity she'd never seen before. The tiger's sexual maturity had triggered territorial and hunting instincts that overrode years of human conditioning. Ashley bent down to fill Raja's water bowl, turning her back on the tiger in a gesture of trust that would prove fatal. The movement triggered Raja's hunting instincts. The sight of prey bending over activated millions of years of evolutionary programming that no amount of bottle feeding could suppress. Raja launched himself at Ashley with explosive power, covering the 15 feet between them in a single bound. His massive paws struck her between the shoulder blades, driving her face first into the dirt. Before she could scream or struggle, Raja's jaws clamped down on the back of her neck with crushing force. The tiger's canine teeth each over 2 inches long, punched through Ashley's cervical vertebrae like they were made of paper. Her spinal cord severed instantly, ending her life in less than 3 seconds. Raja's powerful jaw muscles contracted, ensuring the kill was complete, before he released his grip and stepped back. Raja grabbed Ashley's lifeless body by the shoulder and began dragging her toward a corner of the enclosure, following the same behavior patterns his wild ancestors had used for millions of years. He positioned the body in a secluded spot and began the territorial guarding behavior typical of big cats protecting their kill. Ashley's absence wasn't noticed until she failed to appear for dinner 3 hours later. Roberto Martinez went looking for his daughter, following the path to Raja's enclosure that she walked every evening. What he found would haunt him for the rest of his life. Raja was lying beside Ashley's body in the corner of the enclosure, occasionally licking at the wounds while maintaining the alert posture of a predator guarding his prey. The tiger showed no recognition of Roberto's presence, treating him as a potential threat to his kill. Local authorities arrived within an hour, but there was nothing they could do for Ashley. Sheriff's deputies were forced to shoot Raja when the tiger refused to leave Ashley's body, showing aggressive behavior toward anyone who approached. The investigation revealed that Ashley had been warned repeatedly about Raja's changing behavior, but had dismissed expert advice as unnecessary caution. The Martinez family faced no criminal charges, as Texas law allowed private ownership of exotic animals with proper permits. Ashley's funeral was attended by hundreds of friends and family members who remembered her vibrant personality and love of animals. Roberto Martinez donated millions to wildlife conservation organizations, hoping his daughter's death might prevent others from making the same fatal mistake. While Ashley's naive trust in Raja proved deadly, Carlos Mendez's need to impress led him into an alligator's feeding frenzy. It was March 8, 2016, and the Miami evening was warm and humid, with the scent of jasmine and chlorine hanging heavy in the air around Carlos Mendez's Coral Gables mansion. The sprawling property featured a main house, guest quarters, and an elaborate backyard compound that housed his illegal collection of exotic animals. Hidden from neighbors by high walls and dense vegetation, the compound contained several custom-built pools where Carlos kept his prized alligators. Carlos Mendez was 34 and had built his fortune through a combination of legitimate business ventures and activities that existed in legal gray areas. His import-export company provided cover for various schemes, and his wealth allowed him to indulge in expensive hobbies that most people could never afford. His passion was collecting dangerous animals, particularly alligators, which he kept in violation of numerous local and federal laws. For 5 years, Carlos had been hand-feeding his alligators, taking pride in his ability to work with these prehistoric predators without formal training. He'd gradually acquired larger and more dangerous animals, including Diablo, an 8-foot male American alligator that weighed nearly 300 pounds. Carlos genuinely believed his experience made him an expert handler, despite having no scientific understanding of reptile behavior. That evening, Carlos was entertaining Maria, a woman he'd been dating for several weeks. He'd been drinking heavily throughout dinner, and his judgment was impaired by both alcohol and his desire to impress her with his fearless handling of dangerous animals. American alligators are apex predators that have remained virtually unchanged for millions of years. They can grow up to 14 feet long and weigh over 1,000 pounds, with bite forces exceeding 3,000 pounds per square inch, among the strongest of any living animal. Alligators are ambush predators with lightning-fast reflexes, capable of launching themselves from the water with explosive force. Diablo was Carlos's prize specimen, captured from the Everglades as a juvenile and raised in captivity for 8 years. Despite years of regular feeding, the alligator retained all his wild instincts and had never developed any tolerance for human presence. The 300-pound predator spent most of his time motionless in his custom pool, but his prehistoric brain was constantly alert for feeding opportunities. Carlos led Maria to Diablo's enclosure, a concrete pool surrounded by decorative landscaping. The alligator floated motionlessly in the center of the pool, only his eyes and nostrils visible above the dark water. Against his usual protocol and influenced by alcohol, Carlos decided to hand-feed Diablo instead of using the long feeding pole he normally employed. He wanted to show Maria how fearless he was, how completely he'd mastered these dangerous animals. Carlos knelt at the edge of the pool, holding a whole chicken just above the water's surface. Diablo's prehistoric eyes tracked the movement, his brain calculating distance and timing with predatory precision. The alligator began moving toward the food with slow, deliberate strokes of his powerful tail. Diablo positioned himself directly below the offered chicken, his massive jaws just inches from Carlos's outstretched hand. The alligator's feeding response was triggered by the proximity of the meat, and millions of years of evolution took over. Diablo launched himself from the water with explosive force, his jaws opening wide to reveal rows of conical teeth. But instead of grabbing just the chicken, Diablo's massive jaws clamped down on Carlos's entire forearm. The alligator's bite force crushed bone and severed arteries instantly, while his momentum dragged Carlos into the pool. Maria's screams echoed across the compound as Carlos disappeared beneath the dark water. Diablo began the death roll that made his species so deadly, spinning his massive body in the water while maintaining his grip on Carlos's arm. The rotational force generated tremendous torque, tearing Carlos's arm from his body while the alligator's weight held him underwater. Carlos's struggles grew weaker as drowning and blood loss overwhelmed his system. The death roll continued for nearly a minute, with Carlos's body being twisted and torn by forces no human could survive. Diablo's prehistoric instincts were fully engaged, and he showed no intention of releasing his prey until the feeding process was complete. Maria had called 911, but by the time emergency responders arrived, only pieces of Carlos remained floating in the bloodied water. Diablo had retreated to the far end of the pool, showing no unusual aggression toward the rescue team. Carlos was pronounced dead at the scene, though little remained of his body after Diablo's assault. The investigation revealed his illegal exotic animal collection and led to criminal charges against several associates involved in the smuggling operation. Diablo was euthanized by wildlife officials, along with the other alligators in Carlos's collection. The incident sparked renewed efforts to crack down on illegal exotic animal ownership in South Florida. Carlos's funeral was a small affair, attended mainly by family members who had long worried about his dangerous hobbies. Carlos's showmanship proved fatal with the alligator, but Dorothy Williams's maternal instincts led her into a chimpanzee's violent rage. It was September 14, 2017, and storm clouds were gathering over the rural Oklahoma property where Dorothy and Earl Williams had spent their retirement years. The couple's modest ranch house sat on 40 acres of rolling hills and pasture, far from the nearest neighbors. Behind the house, a series of enclosures and buildings housed their most unusual family member, Buster, a 150-pound chimpanzee they'd raised from infancy for 15 years. Dorothy Williams was 68 and had never had children of her own. When she and Earl acquired Buster from a defunct research facility in 2002, she'd poured all her maternal instincts into raising the infant chimpanzee. She'd bottle-fed him, taught him sign language, and allowed him free run of their property. To Dorothy, Buster wasn't a wild animal. He was the child she'd never been able to have. Over the years, several incidents had suggested that Buster was becoming increasingly dangerous as he matured. He'd attacked a delivery driver, destroyed furniture during tantrums, and shown aggressive behavior toward strangers. But Dorothy refused to acknowledge these warning signs, insisting that Buster was just misunderstood and needed more love and attention. Earl had grown increasingly concerned about Buster's behavior, especially as the chimp entered full adulthood and displayed the territorial aggression typical of mature males. He'd suggested relocating Buster to a sanctuary, but Dorothy wouldn't hear of it. Chimpanzees are humanity's closest relatives, sharing 98% of our DNA. But that similarity makes them more dangerous, not less. Adult males can weigh up to 200 pounds and possess the strength of 5 grown men. They have long, powerful arms, opposable thumbs, and canine teeth designed for tearing flesh. Captive chimps often develop severe behavioral problems as they mature, becoming unpredictable and potentially lethal. That evening, a severe thunderstorm was approaching, with lightning flashing across the darkening sky and thunder rumbling in the distance. Buster had always been afraid of storms, and the approaching weather was making him increasingly agitated. He paced his enclosure restlessly, vocalizing his distress and showing signs of extreme anxiety. Dorothy watched Buster's distress from the house, her maternal instincts overriding Earl's warnings to stay away. She'd comforted Buster through storms before, and she couldn't bear to see him suffering alone. Despite Earl's protests, she decided to go to Buster's enclosure to calm him down. Dorothy unlocked Buster's enclosure and stepped inside, speaking in the soothing voice she'd used since he was an infant. But Buster was beyond comfort. The storm had triggered a panic response that made him view any intrusion into his territory as a threat. His 150-pound frame was tense with barely contained violence. As Dorothy approached with her arms outstretched in a gesture of comfort, Buster's fear transformed into explosive aggression. The chimpanzee launched himself at Dorothy with shocking speed, his powerful arms reaching out to grab her before she could react. Buster's first blow caught Dorothy across the face, his knuckles striking with enough force to shatter her cheekbone and knock her to the ground. Before she could scream or defend herself, the chimp was on top of her, his massive hands grabbing her arms and head with crushing strength. The chimpanzee's attack was methodical and brutal. He bit off 3 of Dorothy's fingers, his canine teeth shearing through bone and tendon with ease. His powerful hands beat her about the head and shoulders while his feet kicked at her torso, each blow delivered with the strength of 5 men. Dorothy's screams brought Earl running from the house, but when he tried to intervene, Buster turned on him as well. The chimp grabbed Earl's arm and threw him against the enclosure wall, breaking several ribs and dislocating his shoulder. Earl's injuries prevented him from helping his wife, as Buster continued his savage assault. Buster grabbed Dorothy's hair and slammed her head against the concrete floor repeatedly, causing massive skull fractures and brain trauma. The chimp's attack was driven by panic and territorial instincts that 15 years of human contact couldn't overcome. He showed no recognition of the woman who had raised him. The assault continued for several minutes before Buster finally retreated to a corner of the enclosure, his aggression spent but his agitation still evident. Dorothy lay motionless on the floor, her body broken and bloodied beyond recognition. Earl, despite his own injuries, managed to call 911 from his cell phone. Emergency responders faced a dangerous situation when they arrived. Buster was still agitated and showed aggressive behavior toward anyone who approached the enclosure. It took wildlife officials with tranquilizer equipment nearly an hour to sedate the chimp safely. Dorothy was pronounced dead at the scene, her injuries too severe for any medical intervention. She had suffered massive head trauma, multiple fractures, and severe blood loss from the bite wounds. Earl was rushed to the hospital with serious but non-life-threatening injuries. The investigation revealed that Dorothy had ignored numerous warnings about Buster's increasingly dangerous behavior. Oklahoma wildlife officials had been trying to remove the chimp for months, but Dorothy had used legal challenges to keep him on the property. Buster was euthanized the following day, despite protests from some animal rights groups. The decision was made based on public safety concerns and the severity of the attack. Dorothy's funeral was attended by neighbors and friends who remembered her kindness and dedication to animal welfare. Earl never fully recovered from his physical and emotional injuries, spending his remaining years in a nursing facility. Dorothy's maternal love proved no match for Buster's primal instincts, but Damon Jackson's criminal arrogance led him into a starving lion's deadly territory. It was June 22, 2014, and the Detroit summer night was sweltering, with temperatures still in the 80s despite the late hour. In an abandoned warehouse district on the city's east side, Damon Jackson's urban compound buzzed with the kind of activity that thrived in darkness. The converted building served as headquarters for his drug operation, complete with reinforced doors, security cameras, and a basement that housed his most prized possession, Leo, an African lion. Damon Jackson was 28 and had built his reputation on fear and intimidation. Known on the streets as D-Money, he controlled several blocks of territory through a combination of violence and psychological warfare. The lion was his ultimate status symbol, a 350-pound predator that commanded respect from rivals and customers alike. Few people knew that Leo existed, but those who did understood that crossing Damon could have deadly consequences. Damon had purchased Leo illegally from a black market dealer 2 years earlier, keeping the lion in a makeshift cage in his basement. The conditions were deplorable. A concrete cell barely large enough for the animal to stand and turn around, with poor ventilation and irregular feeding. Damon had no understanding of big cat behavior or nutritional needs, viewing Leo as nothing more than a living weapon. That night, Damon had been celebrating a successful drug deal with cocaine and alcohol, his judgment impaired by substances and his inflated ego. Several associates were present, and Damon decided to show off by entering Leo's cage to demonstrate his fearless control over the dangerous predator. African lions are apex predators that retain all their wild instincts, regardless of captivity conditions. Adult males can weigh up to 500 pounds and possess bite forces exceeding 650 pounds per square inch. When malnourished and stressed, as Leo certainly was, they become even more unpredictable and dangerous. Leo had been living in deplorable conditions for 2 years, fed irregularly and kept in isolation that had driven him to the edge of madness. The 350-pound lion was severely underweight, his ribs visible through his dull coat. Chronic stress and malnutrition had made him hyper-aggressive and unpredictable, viewing any human presence as either a threat or potential prey. Damon descended into the basement with his entourage, the group's laughter and loud voices echoing off the concrete walls. Leo paced restlessly in his cramped cage, his yellow eyes tracking the approaching humans with predatory intensity. The lion's ears were flattened against his skull, and low growls rumbled from his chest, clear warning signs that Damon was too intoxicated to recognize. Against the protests of his associates, Damon unlocked Leo's cage and stepped inside, his movements unsteady from alcohol and drugs. He wanted to demonstrate his dominance over the ultimate predator, to show his crew that he feared nothing and no one. Leo's reaction was immediate and devastating. The starving, stressed lion saw Damon's intrusion as an opportunity to finally strike back at his captors. The 350-pound predator launched himself at Damon with explosive power, his massive paws striking the drug dealer's chest and driving him to the concrete floor. Before Damon could scream or defend himself, Leo's jaws clamped down on his skull with crushing force. The lion's canine teeth, each over 2 inches long, punched through bone and brain tissue with sickening ease. Damon's body convulsed once as his nervous system shut down, then went completely limp in the predator's grip. But Leo wasn't finished. Years of starvation and abuse had triggered the lion's feeding instincts, and he began consuming his kill immediately. His powerful jaws tore away chunks of flesh while his claws raked across Damon's torso, opening the body cavity to access internal organs. Damon's associates screamed in horror as they watched their leader being devoured by the lion he'd kept as a status symbol. The basement filled with the sounds of tearing flesh and breaking bone as Leo fed with the desperate hunger of a chronically malnourished predator. The commotion attracted neighbors who called 911, reporting screams and gunshots from the abandoned building. Police arrived to find Damon's associates fleeing the scene, leaving behind evidence of the drug operation and the gruesome remains in the basement. SWAT officers were forced to shoot Leo when the lion refused to leave Damon's partially consumed body. The magnificent animal died protecting his first real meal in months, his natural instincts finally satisfied after years of abuse and neglect. The investigation revealed the full extent of Damon's criminal enterprise, leading to dozens of arrests and the seizure of drugs, weapons, and cash worth millions of dollars. The discovery of Leo's illegal captivity sparked outrage among animal welfare groups. Damon's funeral was sparsely attended, with only immediate family members present. His death had effectively ended his criminal organization, and former associates wanted no connection to the man who'd been killed by his own pet lion. Damon's criminal arrogance proved fatal in Leo's cage, but Helen Kowalski's loneliness led her into a black bear's hungry desperation. It was November 11th, 2013, and the Montana winter was settling in early, with snow already covering the peaks of the surrounding mountains and temperatures dropping below freezing at night. Helen Kowalski's remote cabin sat in a valley 20 miles from the nearest town, surrounded by dense forest that stretched for miles in every direction. The isolation that had once brought her peace was now filled with the presence of Bruno, a 400-pound black bear who had become her unlikely companion. Helen Kowalski was 71 and had been living alone since her husband's death 3 years earlier. The retired schoolteacher had moved to the Montana wilderness seeking solitude, but the loneliness had proven harder to bear than she'd expected. When Bruno first appeared at her property 2 years ago, scavenging for food scraps, Helen had seen an opportunity for companionship that gradually evolved into a dangerous obsession. What had started as occasional food offerings had become daily feedings, with Helen providing Bruno with everything from table scraps to specially purchased meat. She'd grown to view the massive bear as her friend and protector, talking to him during his visits and finding comfort in his presence. Wildlife officials had warned her repeatedly about the dangers of feeding wild bears, but Helen dismissed their concerns as government interference. Bruno had become completely dependent on Helen's feedings, losing his natural fear of humans and his ability to forage effectively. The 400-pound bear now spent most of his time near Helen's cabin, waiting for his daily meals, and becoming increasingly aggressive when food wasn't provided on schedule. His natural hibernation patterns had been disrupted by the artificial food source, keeping him active well into the winter months. Black bears are powerful predators despite their smaller size compared to grizzlies, with adult males weighing up to 600 pounds and possessing crushing jaw strength. When habituated to human food sources, they lose their natural fear and become dangerous. Viewing humans as either food providers or competitors for resources, their powerful claws and teeth can inflict fatal injuries, and their unpredictable nature makes them extremely hazardous to be around. That evening, Helen had fallen in her kitchen while preparing Bruno's usual meal, injuring her leg and delaying the feeding by several hours. Bruno had been waiting outside her cabin, growing increasingly agitated as his expected mealtime passed. The bear's hunger and frustration were building to dangerous levels, but Helen didn't understand the risk she faced. When Bruno's patience finally ran out, he used his powerful claws to tear through the cabin's screen door, following the scent of food into Helen's kitchen. The 400-pound bear moved through her home with surprising grace, his nose leading him toward the refrigerator where Helen stored his food. Helen heard the commotion and emerged from her bedroom, moving slowly due to her injured leg. Instead of retreating to safety and calling for help, she tried to appease Bruno by offering him food from her kitchen, not understanding that getting between a hungry bear and his expected meal was potentially fatal. Bruno's frustration exploded into violence when Helen moved too slowly to provide the food he expected. The bear's powerful paw struck her across the chest, his claws raking through her clothing and flesh with devastating effect. The impact lifted Helen off her feet and sent her crashing into her kitchen cabinets. Before Helen could recover or call for help, Bruno was on top of her, his massive weight pinning her to the floor. The bear's jaws clamped down on her shoulder and neck, his teeth punching through muscle and bone with crushing force. Helen's screams echoed through the empty cabin as Bruno continued his assault. The bear's attack was driven by hunger and frustration rather than predatory instincts, but the result was equally deadly. Bruno's powerful jaws worked methodically, crushing Helen's ribcage and puncturing vital organs. Her struggles grew weaker as shock and blood loss overwhelmed her system. Bruno eventually lost interest in Helen's motionless body and turned his attention to the refrigerator, using his claws to tear open the door and access the food inside. The bear spent the next several hours feeding in Helen's kitchen, completely indifferent to the woman who had considered him her friend. Helen's body wasn't discovered for 3 days, when a neighbor became concerned about her absence and drove to the remote cabin to check on her. The neighbor found Bruno still in the kitchen, surrounded by the debris of his feeding frenzy and Helen's remains. Wildlife officials were called to remove Bruno, but the bear showed no fear of humans and had to be euthanized for public safety. The investigation revealed Helen's long history of feeding the bear, despite repeated warnings from authorities. Helen's funeral was attended by former students and colleagues who remembered her dedication to education and her love of nature. Her death sparked renewed efforts to educate the public about the dangers of feeding wild animals, with wildlife officials using her story as a cautionary tale. The remote cabin was eventually sold and demolished, but the tragedy served as a stark reminder that wild animals can never truly be tamed, no matter how much affection humans might feel for them. Thanks for watching. Just when you think love and familiarity can bridge the gap between humans and wild animals, we're just getting started. Click the next video for the next stories that will show you why pets is always a deadly mistake.